These are the Addams Family Chronicles. Chapter 42, Jaws. Many feel that 1959 represented a watershed moment, perhaps one of the most significant and defining years of the 20th century. The post-World War II industrial boom was in full swing, and American prosperity and wealth knew no rival. It was the penultimate year of President Eisenhower's final term. Alaska and Hawaii had just become U.S. states. Fidel Castro had just taken power in Cuba. And the first American soldiers lost their lives in Vietnam. Culturally, 1959 was a great year for jazz, as Miles Davis and Dave Brubeck produced landmark albums in the genre. Jazz was in its final throes, however, having been usurped by rock and roll, with icons like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly, not to mention an as of yet unknown Bob Dylan, the undisputed godfather of folk and the voice for the American peace movement of the 1960s. But when people think of 1950s America, a vibrant automobile industry often comes to mind. In those days, there was nothing more boss than a hard-top Ford T-Bird, or groovier than a Chevrolet Corvette with four on the floor, or anything as swell as a convertible Chevy Bel Air with tuck-and-roll upholstery. Keith's first car was from 1959. It was a Plymouth Savoy, a four-door hardtop sedan named Jaws. It was May of 1976, and Keith was back in Ardmore after a tough year at the university. His plan was to move back with his family, get a job, and save some money. His plan didn't include what he'd do or where he'd work or when he'd start or how he'd get there, but those were small details. Presently, he was just glad to take some time to get his head together and reinvent himself. Besides, Eric was more than happy to take on a roommate, and though the bedroom was small, it provided ample room for his meager belongings. Yes, it was good to be home again, and all things considered, living there was perhaps the very refuge he had sought. Now, Bill and Mom had only been dating for a few months. Bill was a regional salesman for Carpenter Paper, and due to the size of his territory, his network with local merchants was extensive. If they used paper products, and almost all businesses used paper of some sort, Bill knew them. And while some might view selling paper products as mundane, he was good at his job, and the people of the community counted on him for all their paper needs. He was proud of the products he sold, as well as the service he provided, always proactive in his quest to exceed the expectations of the clients he called on. His nature was the antithesis of procrastination, having learned early on that his time was money, and early birds never go hungry. And though he was small in stature, his was the biggest heart Mom had ever encountered. So it's no wonder, through his connections in town, that Bill knew of a job opening at the hospital in the radiology department. It was the perfect job for a young man in Keith's position, and after he placed his application, he was hired on Bill's recommendation alone. It was an 8-to-5 job, Monday through Friday, with no holidays or weekends. The pay was menial, but the opportunity in front of him was worth far more. Keith made a lot of new friends at the hospital, and as he became accustomed with the workflow and processes, he found he really liked the job. His boss was the kind of teacher and mentor that anyone would value, cheerful and helpful, and always available when needed. He liked Keith, too, and held him in high regard as a valuable employee. In fact, everyone at the hospital felt this way about Keith, and through his gainful employment there, he began to accumulate enough money to buy a used car. Once again, Bill had the answer. You see, it just so happened that Bill's father had an old car, a 1959 Plymouth Savoy that he no longer drove, having purchased a newer Plymouth model a few years prior. While Bill was visiting his parents, his father mentioned that he was willing to sell it for the paltry sum of $150, and that Bill could drive it home. True, it was a long drive from San Antonio to Ardmore, but he insisted that the car was mechanically sound. So Keith agreed, and the car was his. When Bill showed up with the car, it was obvious it needed a little work, but like a charming old house, it had good bones. The body looked almost identical to Christine from the Stephen King novel, though the model in the movie was a 1958 Plymouth Fury, not a '59 Savoy. Still, the grille and double headlights in front and the fins and taillights in the back were much the same. The car needed paint and the tires were bald, but there were no dents or any other cosmetic issues. The interior was very clean, with no upholstery tears or rips, and just as Bill's father had said, the engine purred like a kitten, and it had less than 50,000 miles on the odometer. It even had after-factory air conditioning installed under the dash, and Bill and Keith agreed that it was the coldest air that had ever come out of an air vent. This was indeed a steal of a deal, probably made sweeter by Bill's involvement. Sure, he'd have to spend money on tires and maybe a paint job, and of course a stereo system, but Keith figured that a car like this one was worth the investment. A little at a time, Keith made the necessary improvements. The tires he bought were high-quality white walls, and after he polished up the chrome hubcaps with some steel wool, the wheels couldn't have looked better. The stereo he installed had great acoustics, thanks to the large magnet speakers in the back glass that funneled the sound along the dome of the car and filled the cabin with the highest fidelity audio imaginable. And finally, after 6 months of saving, he had the car painted a most unique metallic blue, a color that has never been seen before or since. So uncommon was the color and style that his car was unmistakable around town, and the attention he got earned him local celebrity status. Indeed, this car was beautiful, and when all the work was completed, it was Mom who gave the car the name of Jaws, because of the tail fins that played so prominently in that year's design. Keith stayed in Ardmore for over a year, and in that time, he realized that he found what he had come for, a goal and a plan. The year working at the hospital had served both to settle and inspire him, laying a firm foundation on which to build a career. It was time to go back to college, this time to pursue a degree in the radiologic technology program and a career in radiography. So he packed up Jaws and headed off to college, knowing that this time there was nothing to stand in his way. He found a one-bedroom duplex to rent in the old military district of the city. There wasn't much parking, but there was just enough of a yard for Jaws to squeeze into to park off the street. The neighborhood, though dubious and borderline problematic with regard to crime, was at least quiet, save the constant drone of military aircraft at certain times of the day. Still, the location and the cost were better than he could have hoped for. It was a cold and blustery December night. Keith pulled out of the parking garage, heading home after his evening shift at the hospital, happy to be on winter break from his college coursework. The forecast was calling for ice and snow, and though Keith had little experience driving Jaws on icy roads, the falling drizzle didn't seem to be freezing quite yet. So Keith tempered caution with his eagerness to get home, and perhaps the dearth of traffic at this late hour helped to mitigate most of his concerns regarding changing road conditions. Halfway home, the rain had turned to sleet, impairing visibility and traction. No problems yet, Keith thought. But when he first saw the taillights, He began to ease off the accelerator. At least 200 feet up ahead, he could see a two-car accident blocking both lanes under the freeway overpass. Keith tapped the brakes, but the car didn't respond, as the street here was coated with a sheet of ice. Instinctively, Keith applied the brake more aggressively, but the inertia of the vehicle carried him closer and closer toward the disabled cars waiting beneath the bridge. Within 100 feet now, Keith began to panic as he turned the steering wheel, trying to correct what was now a sideways slide gathering momentum and plunging toward impact. Just a few helpless seconds away, all hope dissolved into inevitability. And a slow-motion moment later, the car slammed violently into the pileup. The kinetic crunch of metal and glass flooded the cabin briefly, unleashing a shower of random projectiles liberated by the impact. Just as quickly, all was still, with nothing but the hissing steam escaping from the radiator. Jaws was in his final throes of a life well lived. Keith crawled out from the floorboard beneath the steering wheel, having been thrown there by the force of the collision. He met with a cold wind as he kicked the door open to survey the crumpled spectacle. It appeared as though the first accident involved a Mercedes and a Cadillac, though it was impossible to tell what had been the damage prior to Keith's arrival. Still, when the police showed up and made their report, Keith was ticketed for driving too fast for conditions, as well as for the total damage to all the vehicles. Jaws was towed to the yard in front of the duplex in the old military district of the city. There he would remain until Keith moved away 2 months later. In the years that followed, it's anyone's guess as to where is his final resting place. Rather than imagining him rusting away in a riverside salvage yard somewhere, it is preferable to think that someone with means might have recognized his worth and restored him to the days of his glory. Regardless, Jaws was a special memory for Keith, and a praiseworthy member of the Addams Family Automobile Hall of Fame. Chapter 43. The Case of the Missing Pot. June 2nd, 1979. A red-letter date in the Addams family history. This was the day that Mom got remarried. It had been 5 years since her divorce from Dad was final, though it probably seemed like an eternity to her. She had found Bill, a man who made her happy again, a man with whom she was willing to spend the rest of her life. Here she stood, on the precipice of finally realizing her own happiness, after 25 years of serving the needs of an absent husband and an all-too-present family. This was her day, the first of many faithful days that separated her, once and for all, from the stockpile of dark and jealous insecurities she had borne in her previous marriage to Dad. She was in her mid-40s, caught somewhere between the exuberance of youth and the despair of decrepitude, an age where innocence and wisdom collide. In many ways, her life was starting over, accepting each new day as it came to her, and never taking a single moment for granted. It was a new beginning. She called it Chapter 1, with an asterisk. Actually, it was a new book altogether, but this one had a happy ending. After the wedding, Mom and Bill spent their honeymoon in Galveston, leaving the kids to look after both houses for the week. They planned to sell them and buy one house together that they could call their own. But in the meantime, there were pets to feed and a garden to water. Keith and Eric took on the task of going over to Bill's house to feed his somewhat psychotic Siamese cat, Tong, as well as water his tomato plants and pick up his mail. This presented no real hardship to the boys, and it also allowed them to share some bonding time alone together. Besides, this small task was a chance to infuse their folks with pride for having raised such responsible and selfless kids. It would certainly be a shame to miss an opportunity like this at such a low cost to reward ratio. Eric got off work at the Ramada Inn and headed over to meet Keith at Bill's house. It was an old house, without central air conditioning, as evidenced by the hostile confrontation of stale, hot air that met them as they entered the house from a side door that connected to the carport. They headed through the front living room and halfway down the dark, narrow hallway to the kitchen on the left. Keith reached into the cupboard and pulled out a can of Frisky's cat food and opened it using a manual can opener he had found in the drawer in front of him. He took it toward the back of the kitchen and dumped it into the cat food bowl. Tong, whose hunger was most probably triggered by the fishy smell of the cat food, suddenly appeared from around the corner, but still hesitant to commit to eating in front of a house full of strangers. When Eric placed the brimming, fresh-filled water bowl down beside the cat food, Tong warily made his way toward the dish, and after a few satisfactory sniffs, crouched contentedly down to enjoy the repast. After they tired of watching the cat eat, they headed out the back door and began watering the plants that grew in Bill's garden. Eric grabbed the hose with the spray nozzle attached and began drenching the thirsty plants. There were tomatoes and peppers, among various and sundry other garden plants that Eric was incapable of identifying. Keith looked around the back of the garden, a seemingly untended area where he saw several dark green plants. He plucked off a leaf and smiled as he headed back toward Eric. "Hey, do you know what this is?" Keith's suspicious smile, combined with the hushed tone of his voice, gave away the obvious. Eric had seen marijuana before. Dad had grown a crop of it in the backyard when the family lived in Waurika. Mom cut it down in a paranoid fit, fearful of reprisal from law enforcement, after she had seen one of the townspeople peeping over the 6-foot wooden stockade fence that concealed it. Eric put down the hose as they both made their way to the back of the property. "Let's smoke some," Eric suggested. He had only smoked marijuana a couple of times. The first had been just 3 weeks prior, when Eric stopped by Keith's apartment in Oklahoma City on his way home for the summer after his first year at NEO Junior College. Keith used marijuana recreationally for artistic inspiration and was well versed in the culture. "No, it's too green. We'd have to dry some out. But I do have this that we can smoke right now." He pulled a perfectly rolled joint from his shirt pocket as he looked around cautiously to see if there was anyone watching. "We'll have to go inside to smoke it, though." They turned off the water hose and headed back inside for privacy. He opened one end of the reefer and lit the other, drawing deeply, causing an intense orange glow that abated quickly as he took it away from his lips. He held the smoke in his lungs and passed the cigarette adroitly into the space between Eric's thumb and forefinger. He raised it to his lips and inhaled. The smoke was hot and thick as it passed over his taste buds and into his bronchioles, eliciting a sudden urge to cough as it filled his lungs to capacity. He successfully stifled the urge, however, and held the smoke down, allowing the drug to be fully absorbed into his bloodstream. They handed the roach back and forth until there wasn't much left at all. By now, reality had changed drastically for the two of them, slowing time and altering basic perception, while inducing thoughts and imagery and awareness that had never before been experienced or even contemplated. They were under the influence, mindful only of the present, enjoying each moment as it came and went, until the side door to the carport opened suddenly, prompting a flood of adrenaline to pour collectively into their nervous systems. They jumped up quickly from the kitchen table, completely unprepared for and overwhelmed by the situation at hand. Tong scurried out of the room and away from the commotion. The smell of hemp was strong throughout the house as a single voice called out from the front room. Keith and Eric looked at each other frantically. Hello? Keith? Anyone here? It was Bill's daughter, Ann. Keith and Eric walked toward the front room where they faced her. You guys smoking pot? It was the first thing she said. They did their best to cover it up. No. Eric answered quickly and tried to look as innocent as he could while telling a most obvious lie. That had always been his M.O. Deny everything until proven otherwise. He couldn't give Keith the chance to confess. He didn't lie too well. There was a long, puzzling silence as Anne pieced together the evidence. Yes, you are. I'd smoked some if Mom weren't outside waiting for me. I just came in to get some clothes to take over to Mom's. Anne walked through to the hall and on down the hallway to the back bedroom. Man, it reeks in here. She laughed as she said it, trying to put them both at ease. Keith and Eric stood in the front room, waiting in silence, still on edge after being caught smoking pot. A minute passed, then two. Do you think she really knows? Do you think she'll tell anyone? Eric communicated his concerns in a low voice, just above a whisper. But suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Anne, are you in there? It was Anne's mother, Nell, peering into the room through the screen door. The boys looked at each other, terrified, as more adrenaline flushed freely into their bloodstreams. A long pause followed. Anne was too far away to answer a question that she didn't even hear. The answer had to come from one of the boys. Again, Eric took the lead and walked stiffly to the door, doing his best Eddie Haskell impersonation. Hello, Mrs. Crandall. He didn't even open the screen door, but rather talked through it. Anne is just getting her things together. Another exposing pause evoked a nervous query. Would you like me to go and get her? He wasn't about to invite her into the house, even though she'd once lived there. No, just tell her I'll be out here waiting. She turned to walk back out to her idling car. Eric looked at Keith, wondering if the smell of pot had reached her nostrils too. There was no way to tell short of asking her. Anne made her way back up to the front room, carrying an overnight bag and a couple of hangers. I'll see you guys later. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. She laughed again before heading out the door and closing it behind her. They watched her as she walked back out to the car, trying to get a feel for the dialogue between her and her mother. Nell backed the car out of the driveway rather quickly and sped off down 3rd Street. Keith and Eric waited a few minutes before they, too, left. A week passed, and Mom and Bill returned from their honeymoon. It wasn't long before the confrontation. I was told that you and Keith were over at Bill's last week when we were gone on the honeymoon. Mom didn't offer up any sources, probably on purpose as to not play all of her cards at one time. Eric thought that it was lucky that Keith had gone back to his Oklahoma City apartment and wasn't available to say anything conflicting. Yeah, Keith and I were over there feeding the cat and watering Bill's garden. While we were there, Nell brought Ann by the house to get some clothes. Eric's answer sounded honest enough, without trying to hide anything. He was happy with the interrogation, so far. Were you doing anything that you shouldn't have been doing? There was a report that the house smelled like marijuana. Still, no sources, but now the meat of the inquiry was on the table. Eric offered up a most robust denial. Marijuana? Keith and me? Who said that? No way. We didn't smell anything like that. But Keith and I did find what we think is marijuana growing behind Bill's house. Eric didn't realize that Mom had known about the marijuana growing in the back of the garden. He was just using his knowledge of it to deflect attention from the events in question. The questioning changed course quickly. Okay, I really didn't think you were. The old house smells funny anyway. Her sudden capitulation on the subject was completely out of character, as Mom had always been a tenacious cross-examiner. Eric was grateful that the trial had ended as quickly as it had, but it also forced him to question why the prosecution had given up so easily. He wouldn't grasp the full extent of the reasons until a year later. Eric completed another year of college, this time closer to home, at the University of Oklahoma. He was back home in Ardmore for the summer. Mom and Bill had sold both houses and purchased a nicer home in a nicer neighborhood. Alicia and Ann both lived there too. They caught Eric up on the household gossip on the very first day back. "Mom and Bill have something in their closet that you might be interested in." They took Eric back to the master bedroom and opened the door to Bill's closet. Alicia pulled a coffee can down from an upper shelf and opened it up, revealing a full can of dried green leaves. The unmistakable fragrance of marijuana wafted up through his nares, filling the closet. There were rolling papers there, too. Eric stood there with the girls in disbelief. He was feeling several things at that moment, nearly unable to accept the truth that was right in front of him. The realization was a harsh one. His parents were the source of all moral teachings on the subject of right versus wrong and good versus bad. They were the makers of rules, the judges of ethics and principles, and the only true and real mentors he had ever known. The idea that they were fallible and flawed humans just like him and his sisters was simply unthinkable. Alicia and Ann waited on his response, knowing that this news was bigger than them all. "Let's smoke some." Eric took a couple of papers and rolled 2 nice joints before they hopped into the 1971 LTD they called Gerald Ford and headed to the lake. They smoked them both and drove around the lake expecting a buzz, but never got much of one. It was probably the weakest pot they'd ever smoked. The three of them dipped into the can time after time until there wasn't much left of it at all. Then one day, the can was gone from the shelf in the closet altogether. Presumably, Bill got rid of it. Whether or not they realized that the kids were smoking their stash remains a mystery. Perhaps they just got tired of smoking pot that didn't make them high. Maybe they noticed and asked themselves where all the pot went, but couldn't confront the kids on the subject. They could have forgotten that they even had that can in there at all. Only Mom and Bill know the real reasons for sure, and maybe that's the way it should be.